Since the election, Republicans have made no secret about their plans to utterly decimate the federal government, but they've saved their most vicious attacks for federal employees who work explicitly to promote their three least favorite concepts: diversity, equity, and inclusion.
As I say often in this committee, I'm a former federal employee. I used to work at OMB. One of OMB's jobs is to help manage the federal workforce. They work very closely with OPM, and we deal a lot with, the regulations and the legal system around federal employment. And I really want to emphasize the comments that were made by the ranking member about how unusual this bill is. We just had a letter introduced into the record from the Heritage Foundation that is supporting this bill because of misguided efforts to essentially stoke segregation, division, and create a victim-oppressor narrative, essentially, is what this letter of support says. But what is particularly peculiar about this massive bill that's been introduced, and I want to note that the co-sponsor of this bill, or this primary sponsor of this bill in the Senate, is Mr. J.D. Vance, our vice president-elect, is it literally, as the title says, is about dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government. It revokes executive orders, it amends the Civil Rights Act, and it amends other parts of the federal code that protect our federal employees. And then it has this peculiar section that the ranking member talked about, which is actually essentially creating lists of federal employees and contractors that would never be eligible to work for the federal government again. Now, we have a word for that in common parlance. We call it blacklisting. And blacklisting comes from the 1950s, when here in this House of Representatives, there was a committee on un-American affairs that was convened under Joe McCarthy. The purpose of that was to purge the federal government and to accuse federal employees and blacklist them from future federal employment. So I'd like to say, welcome to the new House Committee on Un-American Affairs and to the new McCarthyism, because we have arrived here today with this bill. So let's talk about what exactly is trying to be accomplished by this bill and by the upcoming administration, which the vice president-elect is participating in here. Now, okay, let's take the argument to its logical extension that this is really about making sure that we have qualified individuals inside the federal government. So my question is then, why is the president-elect choosing absolutely unqualified cabinet secretaries to be at the head of every single agencies? We've got now a worldwide wrestling executive who's going to run education. We've got a sexual predator who was about to have a bipartisan report released by the House of Representatives to be our AG. We've got a Fox News commentator who's going to run the military for us. So if my colleagues across the aisle want to talk about qualifications, they want to talk about efficiency, they want to talk about the federal workforce, then let's talk about it, because you're talking about putting into place leadership in these federal agencies who are absolutely unqualified, who are dangerous, and know nothing about the agencies that they're about to be appointed to lead. So this is not about qualifications. This is not about having a qualified federal workforce. This is about laying the ground for the purge that they plan on January 20th and in the days afterwards. And we know that because the very organization for whom the chairman just submitted this letter of support is the Heritage Foundation, who wrote Project 2025, which gave us the blueprint for the purge itself and what they are planning inside every single one of these agencies. So we need to be clear-eyed about what this actually is and about what is trying to be accomplished, and why 4 weeks before we're about to adjourn for the holidays, the Republicans are bringing this bill to a markup without an actual hearing. This is modern McCarthyism. They are preparing for a purge. They are going after members of the federal government who are advancing because they are people of color, women, LGBTQ+, other members of our community who have been excluded systematically from participating in federal service and leadership positions, and then they're going to put their own unqualified loyalists in there to take out our federal workforce. That is what this bill is about. It's about creating a statutory framework to do that, and we're going to fight it every step of the way. With that, I yield back.
The lady yields back. Any other members seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
We'll rotate back and forth.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Biggs from Arizona is recognized. Then we'll go back.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentlelady's statement. I assume that she's referring to Pete Buttigieg or Javier Becerra or Mr. Mayorkas, who were unqualified appointees of the current administration. I find that interesting.
My amendment is straightforward, Mr. Chair. The text of it reads, quote, on page 30, line 22, application to HBCUs. Nothing in this section shall be construed to prevent the maintenance and funding of historically black colleges and universities, end quote. This amendment would exempt HBCUs from the federal ban that this bill places on funding for institutions that acknowledge racial oppression. As everyone on this committee can read, this bill prohibits funding for DEI practices, and it defines prohibited DEI practices very broadly, including banning the acknowledgement of racial oppression. Thus, for Title IV of this bill, it bans any organization that recognizes racial oppression from receiving grant funding. This has a direct impact on our nation's HBCUs. HBCUs were founded to provide higher education opportunities to Black Americans who were denied access due to slavery and segregation and systemic racism. These institutions are pillars of resilience, history, and excellence. Many of our congressional aides, and in fact our congressional colleagues, are graduates from HBCUs. HBCUs enroll and graduate a diverse student population, including first-generation college students and those from low-income families. While they make up only 3% of colleges and universities, they produce nearly 20% of all black graduates. And they accomplish this feat despite chronic underfunding. This Republican bill, the Dismantling DEI Act, would result in HBCUs being banned from receiving federal grant funding. HBCU professors, researchers, and students would be cut off if this bill passes as it is currently written.
Chair recognizes Mr. Higgins.
Mr. Chairman, setting aside the rule of construction in the interest for transparent and candid response to my colleagues' query, the amendment is poorly written. It uses past tense and current tense in the same subject matter without indicating a shift in time. You're not just saying in a statement that we acknowledge that racism is a part of human nature and exists as part of the human construct. Of course, the corruption is born of the heart of man, not the mechanisms of man. Every one of us would recognize that racism exists throughout human history, in every culture, in every land. The sun never sets, nor has it, on some manifestation of racism throughout the history of man. Yes, there you go. Statement in Oversight Committee, part of the historical record now. But your amendment, the good lady has introduced an amendment which I oppose because it's very poorly written, and it's quite condemning of the American people and American society. What her amendment is saying is that prior acts of our nation and our forefathers before us have perpetuated systemic racism that currently exists in our country. You're asking us to say that America is systemically racist. And that's not the same as saying that just admit that racism exists, which is what you're stating when you discuss this, but in writ, it's quite different. So I oppose the amendment. Appreciate the effort, but no.
Any other member seek recognition? Mr. Askin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a fascinating colloquy now, and I wanted to just suggest one thought for Mr. Higgins. I actually think this is a very well-written amendment. It says, nothing in this act shall be construed to deny that the federal government has implemented policies that perpetuate systemic racism. And I'll give you one good example, Mr. Higgins. I think
It doesn't say has implemented policies that have perpetuated systemic racism, nor does it say has implemented policies that have perpetuated racism. It identifies systemic racism.
Can I give you
and past tense versus current?
I'm happy to have inaudibly yielded to you on that point. But let me just reclaim my time for 1 sec, because I want to suggest a really excellent book for people who are interested in just this question of how the federal government itself has implemented policies that indeed perpetuate, in the present tense, systemic racism. The book is called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And it's about federal housing policy and the FHA and veterans policy, all of which deliberately segregated America and deliberately gave certain kinds of benefits to whites that were not available to blacks, and then deliberately and consciously redlined areas. I read it, I think, about, 6 or 7 years ago, so but forgive me for not being able to detail more precisely what it's talking about. But the author, Richard Rothstein, explains how federal housing policies in the 1940s and 50s explicitly mandated segregation and destroyed the capacity of African-American families to be in integrated neighborhoods and of white families to be in integrated neighborhoods. That was a deliberate policy. So, I mean, it would be nice to believe that when the 13th Amendment was adopted and slavery was abolished and the 14th Amendment was passed, that everything was okay. There was an effort in the Reconstruction, and again with the radical Republicans' efforts to transfer resources to the recently freed population to lift people up who had been downtrodden by law for centuries. But then Reconstruction was undone, and we got into Jim Crow and poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the whole system of inequality in the law, which lasted at least up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but it didn't end there either. And so there's a real history to it, and I think that's what makes all of these issues so difficult. And I know that there is a theory which is, well, let's not focus on it, let's wave a magic wand and say everything's okay, as opposed to continuing to engage in inclusive and open efforts to redress the injuries of the past and to move forward. And look, I agree with people who think that, bureaucracies are awkward. All bureaucracies are awkward. There's no doubt about that. Everybody finds bureaucracy awkward. But what the process we've been going through as a country is far better than what we've seen in other places in the world, like racial stratification and violence and tribal violence and apartheid and all of those things. So this is what we get in the greatest multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic constitutional democracy, efforts to be conscious of the past and to move forward. So I like Ms. Pressley's amendment. I think it's actually very well worded, and I definitely plan to vote for it, and I'm happy to yield.
Will the gentleman...
And I will yield to the author of the amendment.
To my colleagues, let me just reiterate again that acknowledging these truths is not an act of blame. This is not a blame amendment. It's just simply an act of responsibility. So let's take the responsibility.
The question is now on the previously postponed amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Pressley. This is the Pressley Amendment number 1. Members will record their votes using the electronic voting system. Clerk will now open the vote on the amendment.
Is this the HBCU amendment? Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Yes. The historically black college and university amendment. There's,
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Good teamwork, good teamwork.
have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? This is the amendment dealing with the historically black colleges and universities.
Happy to reread the list of how many of you have HBCUs in your district if you're struggling. Happy to. Wasn't this your big Trump talking point, the black man? Okay.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? The clerk will close the vote and report the vote total.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 40, the nays are 0.
The ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to.
Wow, thank you, everyone.
So yeah, Clay Higgins got told to read a book. And look, the fact that Higgins and his fellow MAGA Republicans voted in favor of Ayanna Pressley's supposedly poorly written amendment is a small victory in the grand scheme of how bad things overall are looking. But it offers at least a little hope that Republicans can at the very least be shamed into doing the right thing. Occasionally.